Speaker, calling this budget a budget for jobs is like calling a vampire blood transfusion expert. I suppose the public should be grateful that the governing party have taken time off from their ongoing civil war to even produce a budget, but somehow I doubt it. Members on this side have been accused by members on the government benches of propagating the politics of envy. On the contrary, it is the Conservative Party which is a slave to the politics of envy. Far too many members of the Cabinet envy John Major his job. But what we have heard this afternoon is a lacklustre budget, a standstill budget, presented by a Chancellor who is saving his money for cynical pre-election tax cuts and saving his energies for positioning himself to succeed the current Prime Minister. But I want to pick up on something which was said from the government benches just a little while ago. A member opposite said that ordinary people would not believe in the recovery until there was some upturn in the housing market. Well, that is absolutely true. And it is particularly true of London and the South East, an area that I know well. But I have to say to the honourable gentleman, who unfortunately has left the chamber, that the sad news is that that upturn in the housing market is not going to happen. I should refer him to page 24 of the Red Book on the housing market. And what it says in the Red Book, the government's own document on the budget, is this: housing market turnover increased strongly in 1993, but has fallen back this year. House prices have moved erratically with no pronounced trend up or down. In October, they were at much the same level as a year earlier. In other words, this upturn in the housing market is not going to happen. And I say to the government, leave to one side all of the things they have inflicted on the British people. People who have suffered from the housing boom of the late 80s, from the reckless financial deregulation of the late 80s and the housing boom that suffered. People in London and the South East who are burdened with mortgages they can hardly repay, who have been the victims of repossession, who are stuck with negative equity. Those people, if no one else, will never forgive the government for its economic incompetence. And members opposite are quite right. People will not believe in the recovery, particularly, as I say, in London and the South East, until there is an upturn in the housing market. And the fact is the government's own figures, the government's own statement, make it clear that that upturn in the housing market is not going to happen. But of course, when you touch on the subject of housing in this Conservative government, you're really touching on a very sad story indeed. For all the gimmicks, for all the professed interest in homes and home ownership, the fact is that this government's record on building houses for the British people is a deplorable one. Since 1979, gross housing investment in England has fallen by 56%, over half. And the victims of this government's appalling record in the provision of housing, whether private sector housing or public sector housing, are ordinary people and the homeless. And of course this budget is not going to do anything to turn the situation around. There is not going to be an upturn in the housing market. The Red Book makes it clear. Current homeowners are going to be badly affected by the cuts in mortgage income interest tax relief due to come in. People looking for social housing, housing in the public sector, are going to have their hopes dashed by the reduction in housing corporation capital provision. And let me dwell for a minute on the matter of the cuts in housing corporation finance. Because this government, having savagely slashed local authorities' capacity to build social housing for rent, have made much of their commitment to the housing association sector. But what this government has done to the housing association sector is particularly cruel. They have encouraged them to expand. They have encouraged new housing associations to develop. And many of these developments, particularly in London and the South East, many of the people in those properties are dependent on housing benefit. And what is happening in the housing association sector is because of the cuts in the housing corporation budget, housing associations, particularly the new ones, are being forced to charge higher and higher rents and being less able to house the very people that the housing association movement is meant to serve. So the cuts in the housing corporation capital provision are a tragedy, I think, for the housing association sector and a betrayal of the hopes that this government is encouraged in that sector as a possibility for providing social ownership, so social housing. And then, of course, there are the cuts in housing benefit. Well, it comes ill from a government which took away rent control to complain about landlords exploiting tenants. It comes ill. It comes ill from a government that has used housing benefit as a means of allowing people access to housing, to now turn round and cut it back. And we have yet to hear the detail of these cuts in housing benefit. But I believe the consequence will be many more homeless people, many more people unable to gain access to housing, and many more people in housing misery. We also see in this budget the reduced housing revenue account subsidy provision, and we also see local authority credit approvals for housing renovations being cut. So what is this budget saying on housing? It's saying the housing market is going to remain flat. It's saying people with mortgages are going to have their tax relief cut. It's saying housing associations are going to be forced to put up even higher rents and will be able to build less properties. It's saying councils won't be able to renovate their huge stocks of housing in appalling condition. This budget is not it's not a budget for jobs, and it's certainly not a budget for housing. And I say to this House, as somebody who represents one of the poorest areas of the country and whose caseload is 60% housing problems, there are few things which cause more misery and cause more damage to family life, which this government is supposed to be in favour of, than the misery of homelessness and poor housing. And far from doing anything about it, this budget continues the policies of this government, which is actually to undermine people's access to decent housing, whether to buy, whether in the private sector, whether in the housing association sector, or whether housing provided by local authorities. But of course, the key feature of this budget is supposed to be the fact that it's a budget for jobs. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with his normal bravura and bravado, listed a whole series of measures which we are supposed to believe are an earth-shattering means of getting people back to work. But the thing you have to watch with this budget, the thing you have to watch with all budget, is the figures. And the thing you have to look at is not the grand descriptive phrases for what the budget is supposed to be about, but what the Red Book actually says. And what the Red Book says is that the Department of Employment spending under this budget is actually going to go down. And I want to know if this budget represents a great step forward, a great leap forward in helping the unemployed back to work, how is the Department of Employment going to do it on actually less money? What the Chancellor has announced today is a whole series of gimmicks, many of them not even new gimmicks, old gimmicks that are currently proving not to be terribly effective. Family credit going to be increased. They're going to accelerate payments for housing benefit. How the government is going to accelerate payments for housing benefit when local authorities are actually responsible for administering housing benefit, I do not know. Family credit to be paid to people without children, community action, work trial, job finders grant, Workwise, one-to-one, job match, work start, a positive alphabet soup of gimmicky measures. But what the unemployed want is not gimmicks. What the unemployed want is a government that is genuinely committed to return to full employment, which of course this government is not. And you know, there is something deeply unpleasant about a government which seeks, even in its own terms, to put people back to work by forcing people, whether it's by the changes in the disability allowance or by the increasingly stringent arrangements in relation to benefits, which seeks to force people back onto the labour market to work for poverty wages. Because of course, if there is a theme to these gimmicky ideas getting people back to work, they are about subsidising poverty wages. And it is old-fashioned, and members opposite will sneer. But I believe that if you do a decent week's work, you ought to be entitled to a living wage, of course.
Yeah, is the Honourable, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, is she seriously saying she'd prefer these people to stay on benefit and stay on benefit for the rest of their lives? Because I only think that's a happy experience for anybody.
Perhaps the Honourable Gentleman doesn't know that it is, in fact, a burden burden on the economy to keep these people unemployed. It is costing it is almost entirely responsible for the growth in the PSBR, the level of unemployment. But if you're not going to let me finish because I didn't interrupt him. What I'm saying, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm saying to the honourable gentleman is this, that in the long run, I believe it is better for individuals, better for the cohesiveness of society, and better for the economy that people can get a decent living wage for doing a week's work than having to be dependent on handouts and benefits. I think it is degrading that when men and women have worked for a full week, they should still be in the position of looking for handouts from the state. And I believe that our policy, which we fought the last election on, and I sincerely believe that we'll fight the next election on and win, our policy of a minimum wage is not just a humane policy, but a policy which tends towards more social cohesion. Why should women work in menial jobs, be it cleaning, be it service industries, be it supermarkets? Why should people work in menial jobs? We hear from the millionaire member for Luton. Of course, he doesn't care about people living on poverty wages. No doubt he made his money out of paying people poverty wages. But I put it to the House that a policy which talks about putting people back to work, but is only concerned to coerce people back to work for poverty wages, is not a policy which in the long run is going to build a strong economy and create a cohesive society. And of course, though we've had this long alphabet spaghetti list of schemes, though the Chancellor has tried very much to boost and promote his little package of gimmicks, again, when you look at the Red Book, when you look at what the panel of independent forecasters are saying, they're not forecasting any particular drop in unemployment. What they're looking at the end of this year is unemployment at 2.5 million, and then possibly in 95 a drop of around 250,000. And let's remember, because it's easy to forget, these figures, this figure of 2.5 million is a gross underestimate of the actual level of unemployment. This government, I think since 1979, has changed the ways of counting unemployment 12 times to sort of disappear people off the unemployment figure. So when the independent advisors say we're looking at levels of unemployment of 2.5 million into the near future, that's actually an underestimate of the levels of unemployment that people are having to live with. And I believe that the shadow of unemployment is haunting every family in the land, as well it might do. It costs Britain £9,000 a year to keep somebody unemployed for a year. It costs every family £1,000 a year to keep somebody on the dole. The gap between the highest and lowest paid worker is higher than at any time since 1886, and there are more people in work reliant on means-tested benefits than ever before. This government ought to be ashamed of this fact, but in fact, they seem to think that it's some sort of benefit. And of course, since 1979, the number of long-term unemployed has more than doubled. So it's a bit belated for the Chancellor and his cohorts in the Treasury team to weep tears about the long-term unemployed. This is the regime, this is the administration which has doubled long-term unemployment in its period of office. And let's be absolutely clear, long-term unemployment hasn't doubled in this country in a fit of absence of mind on behalf of politicians. Mass unemployment was a deliberate economic weapon of this government to keep wages low and, as it perceived, to curb the trade unions. So nobody is fooled when the Chancellor and his colleagues belatedly express concern about high unemployment. This is not a budget for jobs. This is certainly not a budget for housing. This is a standstill budget while the government bides its time for the appropriate time to bring in what they believe will be election-winning tax cuts in the run-up to an election. But of course, the thing that is concerning people out in the country, particularly at this time of year, as winter approaches, are the rises in VAT on fuel. And I would like to return to honourable gentleman opposite, who claimed to prefer indirect taxation, which they called taxes of choice, to direct taxation. And I would ask the honourable gentleman opposite, What choice does a pensioner have about turning on their gas fire or turning on their central heating when it gets cold? The problem with VAT on fuel, and why it strikes the British public as particularly unfair, is that expenditure on heating is something which most people have absolutely no choice about at all. What is wrong about the rises in VAT is that indirect taxation bears more heavily on the income of the poor, and it is quite wrong that the poor, the disabled and people on benefits should have to bear the fiscal burden of this government's economic incompetence. This budget doesn't offer any hope to the jobless. This budget doesn't offer any hope to my constituents in Hackney. This budget, I believe, will be dismissed by the public as merely a blip in the, whereas the important story is the ongoing civil war in the government party. And I believe that the members, government ministers on the Treasury bench opposite ought to be ashamed when they look around them and see the destruction and see the human tragedy that they have wrought with their divisive and ultimately ineffective and ineffectual economic policies.